Welcome back to UX Spotlight by Userlytics. I am your host, Denis Cristea, and today we're talking about something that's reshaping how research teams work, AI. AI tools can now synthesize interviews, generate personas, and speed up analysis in ways we've never seen it before. But here's the real question. As we use more AI in research, how do we make sure we don't lose the human side of it? To help us explore that, I'm joined by Dr. Oduor, founder of CEO of Geeks. With a PhD in human factors and industrial engineering. Dr. Oduor, welcome. I'd love you to start by telling us a bit about your background and what you're focused on today.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, Dennis. Again, my name is Dr. Kenya Freeman Oduor, and I am the CEO and founder of Geeks. I have been a founder for 9 years now. I come out of an extensive career in industry, consulting, and I also have an adjunct role in the computer science department at a university in Raleigh, North Carolina, NC State. So I have a very broad background in terms of having experiences in industry, consulting, and academia.
And what originally pulled you into human factors and industrial engineering?
That's a great question. Coming out of my undergrad program, I wanted to be a physical therapist. I learned very quickly that physical therapy was interesting to me, but did not feel like the strongest fit. I also had therapists that I worked under that told me that the field was saturated at the time. So it was in the late 90s. So my interest in human factors came from looking at the intersection of my interests that I had or in my career at the time, but also my interests that did not show up in my career. So I was very interested in working with people hands-on, very much interested in the psychology of how people think and how they experience things. But most importantly, what I did not get a chance to use in physical therapy was my ability to create systems or things. And so when I did some homework, I found that there was the field of human factors that you could imagine a Venn diagram that has engineering, life sciences, and the social sciences kind of all together. That intersection in the middle is where I wanted to be. And so I found a graduate program and moved to North Carolina to go to NC State to pursue my graduate degree. So I knew that I wanted to study this field very deeply and understand people and how they work and how they think when they're doing work. Because I see everything that we do, whether it's the work we get paid for or how we interact with gaming systems, that is work. You're exerting energy to do something with a goal in mind. And so I see everything in that or through that lens.
Thank you very much for that. And my following question is, how did you start it in your corporate career? So you graduated college and then at some point you got into the corporate world. How did that whole process start?
Great question. So when I was in graduate school, I actually started working at IBM while I was a graduate student. And so was able to go to school full time and flex my schedule at work based on my course load or based on my research load. So it was a really, really good experience because what I had that I felt was unique from my other classmates in the graduate program was I was able to see what we were learning in the classroom and applying it at work and actually seeing it at work. So it made it really beneficial for me to understand how to apply the theory that we were learning, the different procedures that we were learning. I was able to apply them directly while I was working.
Whoa, IBM. That's a very strong entry into the corporate world.
It really was.
It really was.
Yeah. It was intimidating. It was absolutely intimidating. But I look back and I realized that if you want to, I feel like when I talk to other young people about going into the field of research, one of the things I say is if you have an opportunity to go into an environment where you're going to interact with people who are highly experienced and can mentor you early on in your career, that's a really good foundation for you to then launch your career and to have what you need in terms of that background and foundation.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And so you started your career in a corporate world with IBM, but then at some point you gave up the corporate path to become an entrepreneur, to start your own company. And maybe you can tell us a bit more about how you came to start Lean Geeks. Was there a problem that
That
you thought is necessary to be solved and that you have an idea how to solve it? Or was it perhaps something else that pushed you to start Lean Geeks?
you hit the nail on the head. There's always that that light bulb that goes off where you say, there's a need that I can fill. And I recognized in my career when I worked with different teams, and whether it was with development team, the product management team, marketing teams, I realized in working with these different disciplines that there was always a unique perspective or skill set that I and my team brought to the organization. And I realized that there was a lot more to give, that when you're inside of an organization, you're constrained to some extent. You have to stay within your guardrails of what is your role. And I wanted to branch outside of that. I wanted to work with teams who, as a consultant, I recognize that if people are going to pay me and my team to work with them, they actually want what we have to give. When you're inside of a corporate organization, that's not always the case in all organizations. Sometimes the executive leadership is defining that teams have to work together, but that doesn't mean that development doesn't want to go off and do what they think is the next solution, or product management doesn't think that they have the answer. So moving out of corporate into owning my own consulting company was an intentional move to be in spaces where the work that I do is always valued, and that I'd have an opportunity to explore more complex, more broad challenges and opportunities with partners. The work.
Of course, I feel like when doing this, you also have more freedom into exploring certain paths that you think are more appropriate for the industry. And as you mentioned, when you're in a corporate environment for a certain company, they have their own ideas and they see things in a different way. And very, or more often than not, they put constraints on you. So you would perform somehow in the way they visualize the company heading towards.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. There's a lot more openness and willingness to embrace, to some extent, to embrace ideas that might be different or new when someone seeks out and pays for your service to help them do that, versus you're a part of the organization and you're being asked to do that work. And it's different. It's a different level of investment financially, but also in terms of the team's engagement and that sort of thing. Because it's not UX research as a researcher. Yeah, that's my expertise, but I expect that my partners in product management or development are also going to be involved in that research in some way.
That's perfectly right. And for this part, I'm thinking you are working in consultancy. You're very often advising people to make decisions for their own companies, for their own businesses. My question is, when did AI, which is the main topic of this episode, when did AI started becoming a part of your client conversation in a serious way?
Probably 4 or 5 years ago. AI became more of the conversation in considering or finding ways to incorporate AI into their solutions. So before it became a thing for us from an operational standpoint, it was an opportunity for some of our clients to look at how can they use AI or leverage AI to improve their software offerings or their workflows and how they deliver services to their customer, that kind of thing.
And do you feel perhaps let's say on average, do you feel like most of your clients would either look for AI into automation, so into maybe trying to improve the workflow as you mentioned it, or maybe looking into innovating, looking into maybe discovering new things, new appliances that not only can make the already existing workflows better, but can create new ideas and take the company in a different way? What's your experience in this?
That's exactly you said it. It's a matter of innovating. I come from a background, and a lot of the experiences that I have are with business to business or B2B software solutions, which are not always sexy. They're not always the cutting edge, but in a number of industries, having a way to solve those problems for their business users in a novel way was a very important a strategic move that they were looking to make. And so in that, a lot of that meant how do we find ways to further the capability of our software so that we can use AI to make our customers' workflows even easier. In that.
So it's improving whatever platform they're using because it has to be digital, of course, through AI.
That's right.
And now I would say maybe since we're on the same topic, let's maybe talk about a bit of what's happening right now in the industry regarding AI. And my question for you is, in this regard, what do you think it's the biggest misconception teams have when they start outsourcing research tasks to AI? What are they doing wrong?
Yeah, I think that the outsourcing play does not mean you're done. It doesn't mean that you just outsource it, you set it and forget it, and it's done, and you no longer have a role. I definitely think that there's a misconception around that. I like to look at it like your crash test dummy. So when you think about how they test cars, they put the crash test dummies in the vehicles and they drive them into a wall to see what damage will occur to the vehicle, but, more importantly, to the crash test dummy. I feel like we're in the season of using AI in research to help us do those preliminary tests before we actually get to engagements with real human users. So it allows us to perform a sniff test on our protocols or how we're actually conducting the research to make sure that we're asking the right questions, that we are getting the right sort of detail or data from those insights. And then from there, so at the highest level, we can set the strategy for our research. We can figure out, what are the workflows of focus with our users that we need to make sure we're covering. And from there, you go to that second part of things, which is where you actually interact with your real users to get to the micro level, to get the detail, to capture more of the sentiment that you can't capture from AI or outsourcing to AI.
So you're saying it's not as simple as just giving the tasks to AI and then completely forget about it and expect AI to do your job for you, basically. It's more like a tool that you're using to help yourself and maybe speed up your work, but it still needs the human input of
That's right.
using it. So perhaps I'm thinking that maybe people can be good at using AI to help their workflow, but perhaps not just fully delegate it completely to AI.
Exactly. And so you said the key is you can use AI as a tool and you can have AI be your teammate. And so you think about the tools that you use like on your computer that may not be AI related. And then you think about a human teammate who might be someone who's junior level, or they have a skill around computation that you don't, or data, they can organize data really well. Look at AI in that capacity as a tool or as a teammate, but always look at the work that you're doing as a researcher and where can I offload some of this to a tool or to a teammate, and what does that look like? What's the right tool, and then what are the right tasks to engage around?
Absolutely. And I think one important aspect to keep in mind is as well that AI can never be held accountable. Ultimately, as humans who are in charge of our own decisions and our tasks, we're in charge and we're accountable for the products that we accomplish. So then we have to be careful to what extent we're using AI and the trustworthiness of it.
Exactly. And you look at like Waymo, the company, the self-driving taxis out in West Coast. And, at some point when their vehicles were making huge mistakes, at some point you have to say that even though they're autonomous, there are people behind the build and the assembly of those vehicles and the engineers that design them that have to be held accountable to going back and revisiting those things. And so we have to look at research in the same way, that those tools are those junior teammates that we are engaging in the form of AI. We have to ultimately, there has to be someone that can answer to, why things were done a certain way, or what these decisions mean to the strategy and that sort of thing.
No, absolutely. And I like the example that you gave with Waymo. Last time I went to California, they were not available, unfortunately. They were not in use at that point. But even so, it feels a bit scary. I don't know if I would trust somebody else than a human to drive me around.
Exactly. And even though they say they're safer, there's still that, you just said the key is that I would not trust anything other than another human. And even though they say that self-driving vehicles will become safer than we are as human drivers, there's still that element of trust. There's still that element of, I can see and interact with this person as another human being in a way that I can't with AI. So part of it. You just said.
Regarding this topic still, you have talked about the example of lean versus lazy.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between lean AI assisted research and lazy shortcuts?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important to the conversation. And my question for you is, how would you define lean versus lazy when it comes to AI in research?
I think lazy, we can easily assess that lazy is where you just set it and forget it, say, I'll get what I get. You don't cross-check whether or not, what are the inputs that were used? What is the integrity of the data? The biases that might be a part of that data? Was there informed consent and that sort of thing? Versus lean is where you're thinking about, how can I leverage AI to be more scrappy and to get the answers that I need more quickly? How can I come up with hypotheses, for example? How can I use AI as a mechanism to help give me some information to help me figure out what are those assumptions or hypotheses that I'm trying to derive, or where are the areas of exploration or the opportunities that I don't know exist. I know the problem space, but I don't know those specific areas or opportunities. What AI can't give you, and I think where we get lazy, might be to assume that the data coming from AI can build all of our personas and we're done, without really knowing what went into those personas. When you do persona work manually, you're talking to people, you're looking at their workflows, you're asking them about their day. But if you lean on AI to do that, you don't have all of that detail. In all cases, you don't have that detail. So you lose some of the context. And I think with lazy, you're losing that context, versus with lean, you do that heavy lift that's necessary to help you figure out the what, and then you go and do the work to find the why.
No, absolutely. And I think it's also that AI sometimes cannot catch the simple things that humans can when interacting to another human, whether it's a small comment or the tone of voice or things like this. The AI cannot, to my understanding yet, cannot catch that very well, but it takes another human mind to understand another human mind.
Correct. And when I think about the research that I do, I am looking at body language. I am looking at, where someone might start to perspire, or if there is a conflict in what you say, but your body language says something different. So that gives me a clue into the fact that this is an area to probe in, to call out the fact that I see that discrepancy. And AI may be able to do that to some extent, but there are still some things that require that human to human connection.
Okay. Talking about laziness, talking about trying to get the shortcut to get the results that you want, although truly you will never be able to get the results that you truly need by being lazy. That's, I think, a rule that can be applied through most things in life. If something is delivered 5 times faster but is shallower, what is the real cost of it?
That's a good question, because if it's delivered faster but it's its level of accuracy is compromised and it's more shallow and not as useful, you have to ask yourself, where do I use that speed versus when do I do it on my own, or when do I use the human as myself or someone else on my research team to do that work? And I think from a speed perspective, going back to what I had mentioned around doing your exploratory work or your hypothesis work, I think speed to collect data. So a lot of work that I do looks at mixed method work where you want to collect a large volume of survey type data where you can get what type of information. That is where speed is necessary, where you are putting out surveys and figuring out whether or not someone qualifies in terms of your target area that you're focused on. And can they provide you with the data points to help you get to that what? That's where that speed matters. But when you then think about getting to that next stage of figuring out or unpacking those opportunities, or when you think about your hypotheses, getting to the next level of how do we turn this into a solution, a product or a service, that's where you need to slow down and not look for speed in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, because there's always the danger of misinterpreting the data.
Absolutely.
And that's the whole point of research, to not misinterpret the data.
That's right.
And now I want to move on to something that I like to call it the black box problem. That is, one thing that comes up a lot is transparency, especially when it comes to AI-generated personas or synthetic users. And my question for you is, how do you think teams should think about synthetic user responsibility?
So when you think about synthetic user data, I think, again, it's helpful for that preliminary work. It's helpful from a crash dummy perspective to understand where those pitfalls might exist. But ultimately, when you think about the black box dilemma, it's knowing what's the origins of the data. A lot of the work that we hear now is about garbage in, garbage out. So you'd have to understand what went into those personas. Do they have access? Does the system have access to data that's representative of your users that you're exploring? From a cultural context, it's fascinating. A lot of the work that we do has to include an understanding or considerations around cultural context. And how does that impact what you're creating? And so if you're working from data that's limited in the cultural context, you then run the risk of creating something that's built for one population, but doesn't transfer or generalize more broadly.
So you run the risk of getting stuck to that specific niche target audience.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Now let's make it a bit more practical for the listeners. How would you measure if AI-assisted research is still rigorous and human-centered?
How would I measure if it's rigorous and human-centered? If I can take that work and generalize it to work that I was doing on my own, or that a human was actually conducting, if I can see that it demonstrates that same level of rigor, but also that if I am able to ask the right questions, or that black box is transparent to some extent, and I can see some of the how in terms of how it arrived at those insights, that would make that a bit easier in terms of whether or not that work is legitimate. So it has to do with reliability to some extent. Is the system transparent enough for me to see how reliable that data is, but also how relevant it is to the population that I'm exploring?
Okay. Do you have maybe perhaps a system or a measurement to measure somehow the validity of the data? So perhaps that it's not made up, or it's not wrong completely, or it's shortly or slightly off the topic.
Well, that's where you get into, expecting, especially for generative AI, expecting that it can provide sources that are not hallucinations, and that you're able to have some sort of back and forth dialogue with the AI to talk about Why did you arrive at these conclusions? What is your source or your sources of data? I think those types of like the sniff test of the same things that you would ask another human in that particular instance is what you would expect the system to provide as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, at least for now, very necessary. Yeah, I myself ran into this issue a few times when I was in need of some research and I was using generative AI, and it provided me with links and citations, APA that was non-existent. It was just fictional. And then confronted with it, he just admitted, yes, I made it up. And if I would have not double checked it, I would have used it in a document or something, and I would have looked like a unprofessional fool somehow.
Exactly. And that's the same question that you would ask a junior researcher on your team who you told to go and get references from the web. You would ask them, what are the sources of this information? So it's the same expectation that we have of one another around the ability to justify and, provide reference to the work that we do.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. And my next question, it's also now that I know a bit more about your background, a curiosity of mine, and I think you're the most well-suited person to answer this question because you've both been in the corporate world and also in the entrepreneurial world, having started your own company. And my question is, when various stakeholders, it could be any kind of stakeholders in your company, push for more automation and speed, how do you advocate for research quality?
Advocating for research quality and speeding things up comes from looking at, so let me give you an example. We had a project where we were responsible for mapping out, so looking at the macro workflow within this organization. And that macro workflow was around how they deliver services to their beneficiaries. So how do they provide services and all of those steps involved to getting a person who's seeking out their services to the right department. So we mapped all that out. We went through all of the challenges during each of those stages, who's involved, what are the new roles and new considerations as they implement technology, including AI, within their system. So we went through all of that. The way in which we were able to speed up the process is when they had to roll out training, they asked us to give them a high-level depiction of those standard operating procedures around that big map of what we had discussed over months. Well, we were able to use our tool to generate a standard operating procedure of all of that information that was in that table. And that happened within seconds, matter of fact. So that was a way in which we could speed up the creation of that information, but we were working from the reality of the actual descriptive steps of what they actually do today, what their goals were around the future, and who's doing what. So that SOP that we created within seconds was based off of information that we went really deep on as a group. That is a very effective way to speed up the process, because you know that what you have in that table is accurate, but you're using AI as your teammate to say, hurry up and generate this document for me. That translates all of that into a few pages.
So you're kind of using a combination of work that you put in a kind of like a larger span of time, which was necessary. Right. And then you took all of that information and you leveraged AI to have it instantly done.
That's right.
But it's still the work that you put in, which would have not been completed without.
We would not have had all of that reference, because that was really the reference for that standard operating procedure. We would not have that if we did not take the time to facilitate that cross-team conversation around their workflow.
I think you're perfectly right. And now we have gotten to my favorite segment of the podcast. I have to admit, this is my favorite segment, and I say that to every guest, actually. So it must be true then. This is the Quickfire round.
Okay.
And as I mentioned, this round is based on a series of questions, which you can answer by saying the first thing that comes to your mind. And it's going to be pretty short. You don't have to overthink it or give a complex answer. It's more meant to kind of be spontaneous somehow. So on that note, my first question is one AI research tool you genuinely find useful.
I just mentioned Miro. So Miro's AI capability, very useful. I also feel like tools that organize data like Dovetail and Notably, they are very good at helping to organize data that used to take a lot of time to put information in buckets and to tag or code those buckets. I love that sort of as well.
Miro, okay. Perfect. Second question. A human factor AI will never be able to simulate well.
Building rapport with participants. So there is something to be said about building rapport, because once you build that rapport, you can then earn their trust, or you're more likely to earn their trust in that whole research process.
I like the fact that you answer instantly. You didn't even think about it. So you were probably thinking of this for quite a while in your mind. And my third question is a favorite non-tech way to gather insights.
A piece of paper on a clipboard with a pencil.
Piece of paper. You can never beat that. No.
You never run out of power. As long as you have your paper and your clipboard, you're good.
The classic way. I like that.
Yeah.
The next question is one thing researchers overthink when it comes to AI.
One thing that researchers overthink is thinking that AI will replace UX researchers. There are some things, and based on this conversation, hopefully that's clear, there are some things that we do that cannot be replicated.
I agree. But could you maybe mention one of these things?
Building empathy. So
human emotion.
Having empathy. So I believe the most successful researchers are those that have a strong ability to empathize with others. And that is not something you can fake. And that is not something that, even though you can have a quote unquote conversation with AI, there comes a point where you realize in that conversation that there was no real empathy in that conversation. That is one thing I think that we overthink, the fact that today we cannot build empathy into AI.
That is a very good answer. Now, my final question of this round is a very serious one. Coffee or tea during deep analysis?
Definitely a cup of green tea. I need a little bit of caffeine, but I need something to help me chill a little bit as well.
Good choice. Green tea. Would you add a bit of honey to it or?
Yes, I need a little bit of honey too. Yes.
There you go. That's better. Amazing. And now that we're coming to an end of this episode, if the listeners could take away one thing from this conversation, what should that one thing be?
Be curious. Always be curious. I think that in my career, the people that I've hired, even if they didn't have the skills in all cases, those that were more curious than others, they acquired those skills. And in every opportunity that I've had where I've succeeded, it required asking lots of questions and making lots of observations.
Well, you heard it, folks. Be curious. Don't be lazy. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Oduor. This was very thoughtful, grounded, and a very relevant conversation for the way the industry is heading. Where can people find you and learn more about Lean Geeks?
Please connect with me on LinkedIn. Let's connect and have a chat. I look forward to hearing feedback from listening to this conversation, and I appreciate the platform once again.
Oh no, the pleasure is all ours. Thank you very much for joining us and give us such an insightful conversation. And on that note, thank you very much for listening to our lovely podcast, UX Spotlight. I hope you enjoyed the conversation just as much as I did, and I will see you in the next episode. Have a great day, everyone.